Welcome to the Biblical Languages Podcast, brought to you by Biblingo. I'm Nick Messmer, and I'm here with my co-host, Kevin Grasso. In this episode, we'll be talking about how to know what Hebrew words mean. This is our second of two concluding episodes for this series on lexical semantics, and in the last episode, we talked about how to take the theories and methodologies that we've been talking about in this series and apply them practically. And we specifically looked at some Greek examples. And in this episode, we'll be focusing on Hebrew. Let's dive into some examples with biblical Hebrew. So let's do some analyses of words here.
Yeah. So I mean, I think when we touched on the data issue, to begin with. And so I think it would be helpful to look at an example where we have a data issue. So one example is a very famous passage, Deuteronomy 6:5. So the translations are often pretty similar on this. You shall love the Lord your God, with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength. Right, is how it's normally done. If you look at the Hebrew. Especially for the word strength, you wouldn't ordinarily, like if I were to look at the English, I wouldn't choose this word for strength, right? In Hebrew, and so it begs the question, like, okay, what is this doing here? The word is me'od, right? And me'od is most of the time used in a sort of like adverbial construction, ad me'od, right? It's like, literally like until an exceeding amount, right? Or something like that. And so we have here this like very rare use. In fact, I think it's only found in this phrase with a possessive suffix attached on the end, right? And that syntax triggers something, right, different about the meaning, right? And so we should expect a different meaning here. So the question is, what do we do, right? If we only have one example, or two, I think the other example is this exact same verse, right? Just repeated somewhere else. So how do we determine the meaning? Well, I mean, and this is just one tool, right? And this is just an example. If you look at the Dead Sea Scrolls, they actually there are examples of me'od meaning possessions, and in these same kinds of syntactic contexts, where me'od is clearly referring to a thing, right, that someone can possess, right? And that would make sense logically, given what we know about the word being like excess, those kinds of things, that it would just mean the things that you own, right? And in fact, we also have the Targums, right, early translations into Aramaic, and they also translate the word as possessions, right? So we have early, native speaker interpreters translating them. I don't know if the Targum translators were necessarily native speakers, but they were very good at Hebrew, right? And translating it as possessions. And we also have examples from the Dead Sea Scrolls of a similar use of this word. And those are the kinds of things that can really help us. I mean, I think that's, as far as the data goes, that's the best analysis we can give, right? I mean, it's the data we have. So that's a way that we can use more than what's just in the text to kind of figure out what this word is doing.
Yeah. So I just want to touch on a couple of things there. Again, it actually goes back to the pedagogy series where having that sensitivity and specifically having produced the language actively, you have that intuition of what word would I use if I wanted to say strength, and if you've worked on producing the language actively, communicatively, you can answer that. Whereas if you haven't, it's like, I don't know what word I would use for strength. I've never tried to say strength in Hebrew, but so that's, red flag goes up there. But so then what you've done is you've looked at more data, and you've, if you had a good lexical meaning for the word, then you said that you can kind of check it against something like possessions work with the lexical meaning. Is the lexical meaning contributing something toward that sense of the word in this context? And then you looked at syntax. So yeah, you're using more tools does it fit the context though? Because context is an important tool to use as well. Would you say it fits the context?
Oh, it absolutely does. I mean, if you actually look at the context is about, he goes on to say, right, when you go into the land, right, this is starting in verse 10 or so, 10 to 15-ish, because when you go into the land and you're given all these things, right, vineyards that you did not plant, houses that you did not build, remember, I was the one that did this, right? And so the point is, you need to love God with all of these things that He has given you, right? So I think in the context, this makes the most sense. And I think part of the problem too is like, what would it mean to love God with all of your strength, right? I actually don't know. I mean, it's a phrase that we just use so often that it's like, but if I were to say like, I love my son with all my strength, it's hard for me to know what in English that would. I mean, it just sounds like a lot, right? I mean, that's, but that's the kind of thing that like, well, it could mean that, but the context I think is actually pointing, towards this possession, sense anyway.
Yeah, I mean, I wonder where strength came from as a translation. I'm sure you could do a lot there, but I wonder.
The Septuagint.
Okay, well there you go. Yeah, and I wonder if it does have to do with. I mean, loving God with all your heart, all your soul. Like in English, at least, the way we think about. I mean, in English, that translation, it sounds like you're just saying the same thing over and over, right? To love something with all your heart just means love it a lot. To love something with all your soul means love it a lot. To love something with all your strength means love it a lot. So it makes sense. Yeah. But maybe the Hebrew. Maybe even saying heart there means something more concrete, and maybe soul means something more concrete. And okay, you want to give us another example?
Yeah. So the next one is how syntax affects the interpretation of adverbs. So this is something that I haven't read anything on it in Biblical Hebrew. Maybe someone has done something on it. But it's something that's pretty interesting because of how Biblical Hebrew forms adverbs. It'll often use be and then attach a sort of like abstract noun to it. And the way it's often interpreted or translated, well, both, right, is just in plus that abstract noun, right? In reality, I think that the be there is functioning more like our ly suffix, right? And once you realize that, you actually have a totally different analysis and understanding of some of these passages. So one example is Psalm 17:15. So let's start with English, okay? So it's like well known in English that the position of adverbs affects their interpretation. Okay. So for example, I can say, justly she will see her son again. Right. And what that means is, there's some, like for whatever reason, right, it is just, that she will see her son again. Maybe because she is a good person or, she didn't commit some crime, whatever. Right. Let's say she was actually innocent and she's on trial and, she ends up not going to prison. And I can say, justly, she will see her son again. And she can go home, free woman, and see her son. Right. I can't say, however, she will see her son again justly. Right. Or it sounds very, very weird. Right. I would never say that about that situation. Oh, she will see her son again justly. Right. So why is it that when I put justly in the beginning of the clause, that makes sense? When I put it at the end, it just doesn't make sense. We actually can put justly at the end of clauses with some verbs, right? She will judge her son justly. So, she won't judge her son, partially, right? Too harshly, but she will judge her son justly. We're totally fine with that. So it's not that justly cannot go at the end of a sentence, right? It's just that with in particular sentences, it doesn't like that, right? And so the point of all of this is that we know, that syntax does affect the meaning of adverbs, right? And in particular, what we learn from these kinds of examples is that there are some adverbs that can modify entire predicates, right? So we can say that an adverb can modify a predicate or it can modify a verb, right? So if it modifies the entire predicate, that's like this: justly, she will see her son again, right? Which is equivalent to saying it is just that she will see her son again, right? Whereas the verb is like, she will judge her son justly, right? Her act of judging is just, right? So when she sees her son again, right, there's nothing just about her seeing, right? But there is something just about her judging, right? Or there can be something just about her judging. We can also say, justly, she will judge her son, which is ambiguous between those two readings. But the point is that we cannot say she will see her son again justly, because the position of the adverb justly in that case forces us to put it with the verb, right? And that verb see just doesn't allow us to talk about seeing things justly, right? So all that to say, right? So then we come to the Bible, right? We say, okay, why does all this matter to us as biblical scholars? We have an example like in Psalm 17:15. Ani betzedek echeze fanecha. And I actually talked about this example in an earlier episode. I just wanted to revisit it and talk through it a little bit more. So here we have the adverb, right? So first of all, the question is betzedek, right? Is that an adverb or not, right? The English Standard Version will just say, I will see your face in righteousness, right? And as for me, I will see your face in righteousness, right? And so they just say, oh, be, in. Oh, tzedek, righteousness. Oh, in righteousness, right? And there's this, very compositional, ironically, sort of calculation of what betzedek means. But as soon as you allow for Hebrew to form adverbs with be, you can just say that, this betzedek just means justly, right? And then it changes the entire way you read first of all, I will see your face in righteousness means nothing in English, right? I would never say that. I will see your face in righteousness to anyone in normal English. But I can definitely say, and justly I will see your face, right? That all of a sudden that makes total sense in English, right? And so the question is, if it makes sense in English in one interpretation and not in the other interpretation, there's got to be something going on, right? So we've got to be able to translate it somehow in a meaningful way. So the point is that when you have the adverb before the verb, you actually, it lends itself to this kind of interpretation, right? Where it takes the entire predicate. And it makes total sense actually in the context. And as for me, justly, I will see your face. And he's contrasting himself with the wicked before him, right? Who will not. But he is the one who's righteous. And so justly, he will see God's face. So all of that to say, right? This is a case where you have to know syntax, right? You have to know how adverbs work, how, syntax is helping to determine, the meaning of these words. You take another example, for example, like Isaiah 11:4, and it says, Veshafat betzedek dalim. Right here we have betzedek after the verb veshafat, right? And here we have a different kind of verb, which works perfectly fine with the idea of doing something justly, right? And he will, judge the poor justly, mm-hmm. right? So there, right, the verb allows for that adverb to modify it, right? And we see the difference in word order. So all of that to say, it's just kind of a plug for knowing some syntax and knowing just how your own language works, right? And how adverbs are formed in whatever language.
It is interesting. I mean, it's the phrase "in righteousness" it is really vague. I mean, I'm trying to think what I like. I feel like this is the problem. Sometimes you read stuff like that, and because it sounds like Bible language, like you don't even question it, that like it doesn't actually have much of a meaning for you. So like I don't even know what I would typically think when I read like "I will see your face in righteousness." In fact, I don't know if I feel like I would probably think the righteousness is referring to God in like some way. Like I'll see your face in righteousness, like righteousness around you or something like that. But that's like way off track of what it's actually trying to say.
Well, yeah, and it's also just not like syntactically, it's not very plausible. Ani betzedek echeze fanecha, right? It would be ani echeze fanecha betzedek, right? That would be the kind of, putting betzedek at the end actually, might lead you to interpret it that way. Although it would still be a very odd thing to say, right? It might mean something like, I will see your face just like, yeah. I mean, I don't think you would say it, right? I mean, honestly, I don't think you would say that in biblical Hebrew. I mean, who knows, but.
Yeah. So, I want to, let's look at one more example and then what we're going to do is kind of try to tie all of this together, and kind of lay out a more explicit kind of methodology for how to do a word study or how to do lexical semantics. So let's look at one more example and then we'll tie it all together.
Yeah, so this is another example that I've talked about before and worked on. I have a paper on it which we can link to the show notes. But it has to do with the meaning of key and the meaning of the predicates that allow for it as a complement. So if you look up key, right? So key means because or for, since, when, if, etc., etc. And one of the glosses is that, right? So which is fine. I mean, it can mean that in some contexts, right? Or it can be translated that way faithfully in some contexts. But that in English is extremely broad. And the problem is that you will often have cases where there is a potential to translate it as that if you translate a certain the Hebrew word by that English gloss, right? And then you have key, and you say, oh, it can mean that. So as an example, right? In English, we can say something like, "I'm happy that she came to the party," right? And so in this case, right, that is functioning as the content of what I'm happy about, right? In biblical Hebrew, there are no clear examples of that kind of construction with the equivalent verb, right? Tzemachti, right? So the issue then is when we if I said ani tzemachti ki, right? In English, if we just translate it, the way we would normally think, we would often translate it, I'm happy that. But the problem is that there's another interpretation of ki, meaning because. I'm happy because, right? That would also make sense, right? But if you look at the kinds of verbs that actually take ki as a complement, they're very, very limited. And verbs of emotion are not ever taken as, or don't ever take ki as a complement. So then, we have an example. So I'll give an example, right? I'll give a couple examples. So in Psalm 116, it says, Ahavti ki yishma Adonai, right? So Ahavti ki yishma Adonai, in English, we would be fine to translate, I love that, Adonai listened, or Adonai will listen. But in Hebrew, my suggestion is it's I love you, right? God, right? Because, or I love him, right? Because he listened, right? Because Adonai listened. So there's sort of an implicit him there. And because, right, it is giving the reason why. Because we like I said, we just don't have clear examples of these kinds of verbs with ki. So there's a reason for this, right? It's not just just making stuff up. Complementizers in different language. So this is what's called a complementizer, right? Ki. This kind of function of ki. It's introducing a complement clause, right? So again, that in English is the prototypical one, and it's we know across languages that different complementizers take different kinds of verbs, right? They allow for different kinds of verbs, and they do different things, right? And so ki in particular doesn't really allow for emotion verbs, and it takes very concrete things like saw, heard, know, things like that. Things that are, I shouldn't say concrete, they're mental states, right? Or they're mental events that aren't emotional in any way, right? And emotional predicates, again, we know cross-linguistically that they behave differently in this respect. So then we come to an interesting passage, right? Like Genesis 6. So we have a verb like vayinachem Adonai, ki asat ha'adam ba'aretz. So vayinachem Adonai is often translated he regretted, and then that he made man on the earth, right? And so this interpretation works in English because that is very flexible. Regret is a verb, of emotion that allows for in English to be used as a complement. But in Hebrew, right, the actual best hypothesis is that ki is not that here, right? Because vayinachem seems to be pointing to an emotion of regret or sorrow, right? So if you read that a different way, you could just say, Adonai was sorrowful because he made man on the earth, right? So he didn't regret that he made man on the earth,
Mm-hmm.
right? Or repent of, that's an old King James Version translation, I think. But he was sad because he made man, and man is messing up,
Mm-hmm.
right? So we're fine attributing that to God, right? I mean, there are all kinds of theologians that would not be fine with attributing emotion to God, but there are also all kinds of problems with attributing regret to God that he did something, right? Mm-hmm. That he made man. But the point is that syntactically, if you look at how ki behaves, just across the whole lexicon, that's actually the best reading, and it's actually the best reading with the accents as well. That you would take ki here not as a complement to the verb vayinachem, but actually as just an adjunct explaining the reason why God became sorrowful.
Right, and it's such a subtle distinction between that and because in general, but especially here. But it's just this is a good example of where out of respect for the language and doing the hard work of understanding it holistically, the difference between that and because matters, so.
Right. Yeah, it matters theologically, right? What kind of theological problem do we need to solve here, right? Is it that God regrets that he made man, right? Or is it that, God felt sorrowful, right? And those really are two different theological problems.
But yeah, that's another great example of just using a lot of tools from our toolbox, looking at the data, looking at syntax, checking it with the context, and checking it against a lexical meaning, all that kind of stuff. So another great example. So, all right, let's take some time to kind of put all this together. And I think what people really want and need is, how can I do this with other words? How can I take a word and do a word study or do lexical semantics responsibly? And so, yeah, something here is, this is really your bread and butter, is lexical semantics with biblical Hebrew. I mean, that is what your dissertation is on. So I assume that you have a methodology, that you at least used one in your dissertation. So I thought it would be really interesting to just hear, at least high level kind of bird's eye view, but you can zoom in as much as you'd like on different points. But how did you approach it? Just, kind of from square one, how did you approach what you were analyzing, and where did that lead you?
Yeah. So the main verbs I worked on were shafat, hitzdik, and hirshia. So those are just basically like righteousness kinds of words in Hebrew. So from a methodological standpoint, one of the things that I think is important is to as much as I said earlier, beware of the lexicons. You do want to know what people are saying about it, right? To kind of orient you to what in the world this thing is doing. But then as far as like, okay, how do I go about analyzing this word? There's really three kind of big steps to the method that I developed. So one is you look at the data and you categorize senses, or you categorize the verb into all the possible interpretations, right? So I did this with shafat. I came up with 5 different interpretations. So I said, one is to judge or to make a ruling. 2 is to make a ruling between 2 parties. 3 is to rule. 4 is to deliver. And 5 is to punish. Okay, so this is a pretty weird word, right? In that it has like the potential for a lot of different glosses.
And so did these come from you analyzing what other people had said, and this is kind of just putting those into buckets, or was this looking at the data, primary sources, or a combination? Where did you come up with? How did you come up with those?
So it's both, in the sense that people don't really disagree on the range of interpretations. So like we have this. There are certain passages where it's like, okay, this could go either way. We're not really sure about this, particular instance. But as far as like, are there clear examples of these 5 different interpretations? Yeah, and everyone kind of knows that. So I looked at the data, and I also looked at what other people are saying, and this is kind of what people have said. I shouldn't say. This is what not everyone would say this, right? Not everyone would break it up into these 5 interpretations, but this is what I think is the best analysis. So we can call these like contextual meanings, for example, or I would call them interpretations, right? Not the meaning of the word. What I will say, right, and what I do say in my dissertation is that there's actually one core meaning of shafat, and every even though there's 5 different potential glosses, at least we can all relate it back to one core meaning. So the next sort of step then is to take these 5 meanings and to say, okay, how can we relate the semantics to the syntax? And it turns out we can. So the meaning of like to make a ruling, for example, or to judge, for the syntax, the object is always a single person being ruled, right? If you contrast this with the sense of to rule, you have to have a plural or collective, rulee, and usually an adverbial marking the duration of the state. So this is what you see in Judges, for example, Vayishbot Yair Yisrael, Esrim Shana, right?
Sorry, what
Yair judged.
What was the when it's singular? What is the sense or gloss?
To judge or make a ruling. So I just make a ruling about, a particular case or person, right? And then we have to decide between two parties. You always have the prepositional complement between, ben, introducing the two parties. And then the last one is to deliver or punish, right? And both of these have the same syntax. And the subject here is actually playing a different role as what I call an executor of the ruling. And the modification, like modification meaning syntactic modification of the result state, is possible. So result verbs like this are often have a result state that can be modified. So for example, someone can break a vase into smithereens, and the vase, or let's say like into 1,000 pieces, right? And the vase ends up in 1,000 pieces, right? That's the result state, of the vase. So the point here is that's possible with this deliver, punish sort of meaning, and it's not possible with the other, or you just never see it, right? With the other meanings. So what we've done here is we've linked up semantics and syntax. There are certain syntactic and contextual, right? Context, like narrowly, right? Not just like broad context. But there are certain syntactic and contextual clues that help us decide which meaning is active in a given text.
So that's really helpful. So, you looked at the data, you looked at, other analyses, you came up with a handful of contextual meanings, and you connected those to syntax. And so, like, you would say that when shafat occurs, with a particular syntactic environment, it must mean, this gloss, or this, it must have this meaning rather than that other meaning, sort of thing, right?
Right, exactly. And there are going to be some environments that, the syntax can isn't going to disambiguate it completely, okay. Right?
Yeah.
But that being said, what we can do is we can then, with these tools, what we've already established, come up with a single meaning. So really we can so for example, to make a ruling, right, is related to ruling a certain group, because the ruling a certain group requires a plural object, right? And basically it just means that the subject has the authority to make rulings on that group, right? So that's how you get to that sense. And I have 10 pages on how that actually works semantically. But the idea being that this is a trigger, right? That allows for this meaning, right? And you can show compositionally why that's the case. And then you have contrast that, for example, with to deliver, right? So this is an interesting one because a lot of people say that shafat means something like deliver, or it's very popular to sort of like say that shafat or mishpat can mean salvation, right? Or to save. And in fact, Daniel Block in his commentaries, commentary on Judges says that maybe we should call this the Book of Deliverers, and he suggests this for a meaning of shofet, which I don't think is correct. But the issue here is that you do have some context, right? Some pretty remarkable examples where it's very clear that you have this interpretation. So the one that I use most often in the dissertation is in 2 Samuel 18:19. Ki shefato Adonai miyad oyavav. So shefato, shafat oto, right? Adonai. So it's he, Adonai like made a ruling on him, right, from the hand of his enemies, right? So if you interpret, if you translated that very quote unquote literally, it doesn't really make sense. but it actually does make sense if you give a certain interpretation, or if you give a certain meaning to shafat. So one of our senses was make a ruling, right? And that's the most, often cited sense, and the reason why we often say judge. Shafat means judge, right? As this conversation makes clear, I think the root rule in English is better, is a better approximation than judge. But you can say that these two meanings are actually have something in common, by just saying that, like, God in this case executed a ruling. So he didn't. It's not that he, it's not that he made a particular, came to a particular mental stance about David, right? This is the context that David is being saved from his enemies. But it's that he actually did something to help David's situation, right? He saved him from his enemies, right? That's how it's normally translated or delivered, right? But it doesn't mean the same thing as save or delivered, because that's not the word that's used, right? And so like we do want to say that there is some difference, and so basically what we can say is that shafat can mean either make a ruling or execute a ruling, right? So the sort of logical problem, right, we then have to solve is why can it mean both, right? And or is there something more generic, that some sort of generic meaning that we can assign to shafat that accounts for both, right? And I think there is. Basically, the idea is that the verb shafat, all it says is that the subject performs some action in relation to a ruling, right? There's some ruling that the subject does something with. So either the subject makes a ruling, right? And in particular in a court context, this is the most salient reading, right? But if the person who is the subject is actually responsible for executing a ruling or has the authority to execute a ruling, like God, right? God has the authority to execute decisions that he makes, right? Then what ends up happening is that the verb is interpreted as just the action, right? That's related to the ruling is executing that ruling and not making that ruling, right? And so you can see in the context in court cases where, of course, this verb is going to mean making a ruling, right? And then in other contexts, like shiftu in Isaiah, right? Here, I just pull it up. In other contexts, like in Isaiah, right, you have shiftu yatom, rivu almana, right? Shiftu yatom is judge the orphan, right? It's a command to judge the orphan. The people are not being commanded to, judge the orphan in a particular way in a court case, right? They're being commanded to execute the ruling that has already been made about orphans, right? The command that they know, right? They know that there is a rule, right, about orphans on how to treat them, right? And God is saying, you need to execute this, right? You need to do this, because they are the ones that are responsible for carrying that out. So just the idea is that we can disambiguate these different interpretations by paying careful attention to the role of the subject in the context, the different syntactic environments, and then we can also come up with a meaning that does constrain our interpretations, right? Shafat, the contribution of shafat to the context is some sort of action that is related to a ruling.
Right. Yeah. And I think that's just a good example, again, of just why getting down to that lexical meaning, invariable meaning, or core meaning, whatever you want to call it, again, is just the constraints, because like when you do have maybe an occurrence that doesn't seem to at least at first look fit one of the different senses you have, like the temptation would be to just create another category that which might be what you need to do, but it might not be. And when you have a constraint like a lexical meaning, it just pushes you to ask more, look into it more thoroughly. Like, actually, like, can it doesn't mean something that it doesn't seem to mean on the surface. And it forces you to go that extra step. And maybe it does end up, maybe it does end up fitting in a different bucket than you had identified. And then that's great. You have another bucket, another, sense of the word or something like that. But just having that constraint is really, really important. So,
well, and I think it helps to prevent us from being too theological about these things, right? Because there's going to be a tendency for this kind of word to say, oh, it can mean save or deliver, therefore it means save or deliver, right? No, actually, the word itself is contributing something, right? And that's not what it's contributing, right? And so when we talk about what that word means, it does not mean deliver, right? It is used sometimes in those contexts, right? And so again, then the question is, what makes up those contexts, and how do we determine that, right? And we can come to an answer on that. But that's why, you going back to the first sort of fallacy that we talked about, just because a word can mean something doesn't mean it does mean something in a particular context, right? And the best approximation in English, we then can give a better approximation in English, or a better gloss, right? If we know the core meaning of the word, right? If you just look at one sense, then you might think that it means save or deliver or whatever. But if you're looking at the totality of how it's used, then we can say, okay, what gloss does fit it best? And rule, I think very clearly fits it best in English. And then that also helps to, actually just our understanding, and in our translation, it's like, okay, what does rule mean, right? That's going to be closer in meaning to what shafat is than, a lot of other things that have been proposed.
Right. Yeah. And, just one more thing on the lexical meaning, understanding that it doesn't mean deliver or save or something like that. There are other words that could have been used if those were the exact ideas that wanted to be conveyed. And so then it pushes you to ask the question, because shafat actually contributes something, there's a reason it was chosen in this context that is about deliverance, but it was chosen rather than a word that means something more like deliver. And so it brings more nuance to your interpretation as well.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And that's part of the point with the shiftu yatom, right? There actually is a mishpat yatom. There is a rule about the orphan. You have a requirement to do with the orphan that you already know, right? And so when you're called upon to do that, you're not called to just save the orphan, right? Just do something nice for the orphan. You're called upon to fulfill your obligation. God has already obligated you to do that. And now he's saying you need to execute this.
Right. Awesome. So just running back through that methodology, step one is looking at the data and kind of beginning to categorize it into different senses and determining the range of meaning. And I imagine during that process, there's a bucket of I'm not really sure,
Sure.
Sure. Difficult cases. But then you have some buckets, and then I think step two was then describing the syntactic environments, or really maybe it isn't other things that determine kind of when an occurrence goes into each of the buckets, right? Defining the kind of parameters of those buckets.
And I would call that the syntactic context.
Right. And then, even just that step, you might begin taking things out of the I'm not really sure bucket, because you might notice that syntactic environment about it and realize, oh, maybe it goes in this bucket, and then you check it and it makes sense. Good to go. And then from there you start, kind of looking at the different buckets and trying to figure out what is the word contributing to each of these contexts. What's kind of the common denominator. And from there you can kind of determine a lexical meaning or the core meaning. And again, then you can take that lexical meaning to the remaining unknowns and start to ask how, when you take this lexical meaning and drop it in that context, what can it mean, and then maybe it'll fit into one of the buckets.
What's the most likely?
Right. And maybe it creates another bucket, I don't know why I keep using buckets. I kind of like that description of it. And so you can see with that there is kind of, there's a good methodology there, but again, it is a cyclical thing where each step can help you refine previous steps. And then you can, and maybe I imagine you maybe kind of ran through that methodology multiple times, where you kind of went back and revisited.
Hundreds.
Revisited the data, et cetera. But it's helpful to have some clear steps to take. So as we wrap up here, I just want to talk a little bit about how within kind of the field of biblical language studies, we can improve in the area of lexical semantics. And we've talked about a lot of things. Obviously one is like having a methodology is important, and an explicit one that you're following. We talked about just paying closer attention to syntax and understanding how Greek and Hebrew syntax work more. Just having stronger Greek and Hebrew skills in general, being able to read the text more fluently and developing sensitivities to things like syntax and other things like that. What would you say to that question? How can we move forward as a field in this area of lexical semantics?
I mean, I would just say, maybe two things. One is you really do need to go back to the data again and again and again, right? We are dealing with probabilities. The reality is that we don't have access to native speaker intuitions. We can't just ask someone, what this word means. And so we are, constrained in that way. And the thing that we have to do is we have to go back and use the data that we have. And that's why I push for syntax so hard, is because it is solid data, right? There are so many other things, even context, right? Context is an interpretation of what the author is trying to convey. It's not solid data. And so, but how, like, the syntactic environment that a word is found in is solid, right? And so just, an encouragement to go back to the data, again and again and again. Yeah. So, and the other one is just, related to it, is just to have a sense of humility when we're doing these kinds of things. We are dealing with a dead language, that we are not native speakers of, right? And we're coming up with hypotheses that are very, very difficult, if not impossible, to check, right? To falsify. And so there does have to be, a lot of humility. But at the same time, we have to use the tools that we have, right? Modern linguistics has developed all these tools for figuring out what words mean. And so if we don't use those tools at our disposal, we're going to end up with analyses that are just not as good, right? Because we just don't understand how language functions, and how, this particular language functions, and how, meanings combine to form meanings of bigger units. All those things are just crucial for figuring out, exegetical problems that are theologically significant, right? And really, I think most people, that's kind of what they're after, right? It's I want to be able to read the text and understand it better. And in order to do that, you really do have to do, the homework. You have to have some theory of meaning, because if you don't, you're going to end up making mistakes.
All right, so that is all we have time for today. Thank you to all of our listeners for joining us. We hope you enjoyed this episode of the Biblical Languages Podcast, brought to you by Biblingo.